Estamos aqui para entrevistar o professor Russel, da Universidade de Saskatchewan, no Canadá. O professor Russel é um professor emérito dessa universidade e também considerado um dos maiores especialistas na ginástica internacionalmente. O professor foi presidente da Comissão Científica da Federação Internacional de Ginástica durante muitos anos e também foi o coautor, ajudou a desenvolver alguns dos manuais, dos livros de educação de treinadores de ginástica que até hoje são usados em vários países, entre eles Canadá, Austrália, Nova Zelândia, Portugal, por exemplo. O professor Russel também é um dos maiores responsáveis por lecionar o curso de formação de treinadores da Federação Internacional de Ginástica e por 2 semanas esteve presente na FEF UNICAMP com uma série de atividades e por isso nós aproveitamos a oportunidade para entrevistá-lo. Eu, o professor Marco Antônio Coelho Bortoleto e a professora Laurita Marconi Schiavon, ambos da FEF UNICAMP.
Caro professor Keith, você poderia falar para todos nós sobre a sua formação como treinador e posteriormente como pesquisador nessa área?
Yes, I am both. Most of my life, I was a young coach, like you and like everybody else. We start young coach. But very early in my career, I was asked to be a coach educator because I had protégés that my job was to train young coaches. So I started very young to be a coach educator. But all my life I was coaching, before university, during university, after university, and along the way I was fascinated in science of coaching. So I did my degrees at university spread out through my life. I went to school for a few years, then took 6 years off, a few more years, master's degree, took 10 years off, PhD. So I studied science much of my life while I was coaching. And I wanted to become quite knowledgeable in all sciences relative to gymnastics. I didn't ever want to be a researcher in one small aspect of one science of gymnastics. So that's a difficult position to be at a university. They want you to be very specialized in one science, one part of one science. But I chose my career to be a science researcher of the researchers relative to gymnastics. So I study the researchers.
Professor Russel, o senhor acredita que a sua experiência como ginasta e depois como treinador contribuiu positivamente na sua atividade como cientista?
Most definitely. I think my experience as a gymnast, because I was a competitive gymnast, and I wasn't the highest level, which made me more curious. I think I was not the most successful, so I became a more successful coach than I was a gymnast. It's true many times. The best athletes sometimes don't want to coach or don't coach well. The level below want success. They didn't get success as a gymnast or as an athlete, so they get success as a coach. So yes, my experience as a gymnast, I think, made me a better coach. But coaching, I very, very quickly learned when I was coaching that I needed more knowledge, I needed more science. And so the coaching led me to the science, not the other way around. So I was curious always as a coach how to make science applied to coaching. Not science for science, but science to make better coaching.
Falando de ciência, professor Keith, quais foram os maiores desafios para consolidar-se no campo científico?
Yeah, lots. Many things have not been researched well in gymnastics. As a matter of fact, I believe the total amount of research has decreased over the last 30 or 40 years relative to gymnastics. We need data. It would be so good to have more information, more data on injuries. We have generally in the world of gymnastics, the injury rate is not high by the research. But at competitive high levels, it would appear to be the opposite. The injury rates are very high per 1,000 training hours. But we don't have good data on that. We really don't have good data on that. Most countries do not research their injuries well. So the injuries continue because we are only guessing. For me, that would be almost number one in the physical medical side. But we have very little information on the behavioral side about child abuse, for example, emotional, psychological, physical, sexual. Like that whole area of child care. We don't know a lot. We don't have good data. We know there's a problem because we have people in jail. We have some problems there. We know from interviews with past athletes that they consider that they were physically or mentally or emotionally abused. But we have so little data about that. We need that. We need injuries. We need data on any kinds of abuses that are going on in our sport. Mostly it's wonderful, mostly. But we need data. Thirdly, the early specialization. So we take children at a very young age and we put them into stressful, high-level competitive situations. We don't have really good data on the positive and negative effects. I often tell stories about when I give workshops to coaches, or more so when I give workshops to scientists. I say, many years ago I went with a Canadian team to China. It was many years ago, and the gymnasts were older, young adults, 18, 19-year-old, men and women. And we were 3 weeks in China, and it was a disaster. We had so many problems, particularly with the female athletes. They were going through puberty, and they were going through menstrual problems, and they were falling in love with the boys, and it was a disaster because they were so emotional and they were gaining weight from all the eating, and it was really a troublesome, traumatic trip. About 10 years later, I went back with another team, and they were young pre-pubertal. Only the girls. The boys were the same age. The girls were pre-pubertal. There were no problems. These young children had no problems with that trip. They had no weight problems, they had no falling in love problems, they had no menstruation problems, they had no emotional problems. If they lost their teddy bear, it was a problem. But so these children, these pre-pubertal children, actually were far less negatively affected by that, what we think is a stressful situation. But again, we have so little data on early specialization, the negatives and the positives. So I would love sports scientists to address the injuries, address the abuse problems. The little that we have, it still must be researched. And of course, early specialization. It's not all bad, but it's not all good. But we need data.
Professor, falando sobre a educação e formação de treinadores esportivos, especialmente de treinadores de ginástica, que conhecimentos são fundamentais na sua opinião?
Oh, big question. Have we got 5 hours? So, For me, one of the number one things that coach educators and coach education systems should deal with, of course, is child care in gymnastics, early specialization in sport. So really, number one in all of our coach education should be the care of the child. And really the child care should be primary. Performance should be secondary. And if we have happy, healthy children, we should have better performance. But it's not always the case. Many coaches, I think, performance. Many parents, even. The performance of the child is number one in gymnastics. And sometimes the child care suffers. They are children. They are children that we have, and they should have fun, and they should enjoy gymnastics, and it should be healthy. So I think number one in coach education is this whole concept that it is child-centered. It is the athlete that we're there for, not for our agrandissement, our betterment. It's for the child, number one. Number two, I think coach education. I have been many countries in the world and saw much of coach education. And I think we still have not done a good job of integrating science and coaching. So often, science is here, coaching is here, scientists are from Mars, coaches are from Venus, and it's like this, they're always apart. The scientists are very often charged with educating the coaches, but they're not from the same world, usually. So to integrate science into coaching more should be primary, secondary at least, in coach education. They don't need a lot of science, they need a lot more applied science. Science directly for coaching, to make the coaching better. It's still, for me, around the world, there's like this, rare. And for me, probably the third area, and again, it's now behavioral areas, and it's the ethics. Ethics is really an interesting field of study. It's not just child behavior. It's coach to coach, coach to judge, parent to coach, but ethical behavior in our gymnasiums. We have cultural, what would I call it, cultural norms in some of our gyms and some of our sports. And sometimes the cultural norm is hard work. We have foreign coaches coming into our countries, and sometimes their ethical standards are different. Some of our own ethical standards are not very high. So again, I think science, educating coaches, it should focus on good ethical behavior.
Professor Keith, no Brasil ainda existe dúvidas sobre o treinamento intenso, né, sobre essa questão do treinamento intenso e o crescimento. O que os seus estudos indicam no caso da ginástica?
It's not only in Brazil, by the way. Around the world there's confusion on this topic. And there's good reason for confusion, because the research does this. There is research this way and there's research this way. There's much research that says, yes, gymnastics is harmful for growth. There's much research that says, no, gymnastics is not harmful. There was even a very famous, very well received, well accepted journal who had two articles, one and the other. So they actually put together one team and another team, and one team argued yes and one team argued no in the journal, Scientific Journal of Pediatric Sciences. So my one of my tasks as when I was president of the Scientific Commission of the International Gymnastics Federation was that I gathered together at FIG's expense, I gathered together the 10 top researchers in the world. So 5 had written and researched, done research that said yes, there was negative effects. And 5 said no, there were not negative effects. And they were all published top scientists in the world. We brought them together in Lausanne in Switzerland. We reproduced all of the articles. And we sat on the 2 sides of the table for 2 days, and we did each article one after the other, and they argued. Very good scientists listening to each other and agreeing at the end of that weekend, and subsequently in 2013 publishing an article that said, no, there is no credible scientific evidence that gymnastics training, intensive gymnastics training in prepubertal children affects growth. It doesn't affect the growth in height. It doesn't affect the growth in proportions, because 2 studies thought they had found a difference, that the gymnasts had shorter upper bodies than lower bodies, and they published that. But in this meeting, the other scientists point out arguments, point out deficiencies, and the authors agreed there was a problem in their research. So that article is published, and it really had 5 points, and the 5 points were that there was no evidence, no credible scientific evidence that gymnastics affects growth, that it affects proportions, that it affects onset of puberty, that it affects any part of the growth cycle. So the problem is there were many researchers, particularly in the medical field. When I say medical field, it's medical journals. Medical people are usually not trained in research, and they're usually not trained in growth and development like the people we had on our committee, which were endocrinologists and growth specialists in growth. That's what they studied. And I have many times listed the articles that say, oh, we studied 100 gymnasts and 100 normals, and the gymnasts are smaller. Therefore, gymnastics must cause children to be smaller. Well, of course, that's correlative, that's not research. But there's many of those out there published, particularly in medical journals. What happens is we have a selected population. Children who are tall, children who are early maturing, they gravitate to power sports. They gravitate to football. They gravitate to basketball because they're taller, because they're early maturing. What about the short stature family? Late maturing child. Where do they go? They don't go to basketball. They don't go to athletics because everybody's faster than them. They're late maturing. Where do they go? They go to gymnastics. It's an advantage. So we end up with late maturing, small stature children gravitating to gymnastics. They're small because their parents were small. They're late maturing because their mother was late maturing or their father was late maturing. They're not late maturing or small because they do gymnastics. And that's what's the problem is. People have these little correlation studies and say, oh, gymnastics is harming children. It's making them grow. It's stunting their growth. We even use the term in English, delayed maturation. It's not delayed. It's absolutely normal. The maturation will start for a girl from 10 years old to 15 or 16. There's a large spread in when they start and when they reach their peak. It's a big spread. And those that are late maturing. Nothing delayed it. Those that are early are genetically early. Nothing accelerated it. We don't say accelerated maturation, but we always use the word delayed maturation. And it's a poor term. Nothing delayed the gymnast's maturation. They are late maturing, they are small stature, and if a study really wants to, say, compare those gymnasts with the normal population, they must compare the gymnasts to a normal population of small stature, late maturing children. Now compare those, and you won't see the big difference that you see when you compare a normal population and a selected population. So doing high-level competitive gymnastics, I don't believe at this stage of my knowledge does anything to harm your growth. It will not make you small any more than playing lots of basketball will make you tall.
Professor, no que diz respeito à formação de treinadores, o senhor esteve envolvido com vários programas de vários países tratando de estabelecer standards, estabelecer programas que preparam os treinadores para atuar no campo da ginástica. O que você pode nos dizer sobre isso?
Yeah, it's a very good question. That many countries have no formalized coach education in gymnastics, and many countries have. And I was involved with Canadian and Australian and New Zealand, and I've been close with the British, and I certainly have worked with many coaches in Canada who came from other countries, Eastern European countries, Asian countries. And then I was also involved with, from the very beginning, the FIG, the International Gymnastics Federation. They have a program of very standardized coach education. For me, if a country, say a country the size of Brazil, the population of Brazil, does not have a formalized coach education program, it's the Wild West. I mean, it's anybody can do whatever they want, and maybe you'll have some success here, maybe you'll have some success there. But to have even standards of ethical behavior, even standards of coach knowledge, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. Doesn't mean you can't have really high performance, because you hire the best coaches in the world, put them in one gym, and let them go. You can have high performance. That doesn't mean you have a high standard of gymnastics in your country. It only means you have money to bring athletes into one place and make them high level. So for me, the coach education, systematized levels, integrating science, is the only way to go to have a national, healthy, progressive program of gymnastics. It starts with coach education. Why do we have gym clubs? Why do we have gymnastic centers? For gyms, for gymnasts. That's why we have it. So if we have centers for the gymnasts, who coaches the gymnasts? Well, it's the coaches of the country, all across the country. And therefore, the most important part of gymnastics for me in any country is not the officials, it's not the administrators, it's the coaches, because they bring more gymnasts, they bring higher level of gymnasts. So if the coaches are the most important part of the whole program, where is your coach education? Obviously, the most important part of your program should have the most important education. So I think many countries, their judges' education is way better than their coaches' education. Why? It doesn't make sense to me. So I would say there are, for example, the International Gymnastics Federation has a very, very good program of levels of coach education. It's extremely good, probably one of the best of all sports in the world. And some countries just adopt it. It's very inexpensive and it can be adopted. Or many other countries have similar. Many countries have just physical education and coach education at universities, and they have no coach education separate. Other countries have only coach education outside of the universities. Or you have a combination. But you need, everybody, I think all countries need a very good coach education system. And that's what will change gymnastics for the better.
Muito obrigado. Em nome da Faculdade de Educação Física da UNICAMP, do Grupo de Pesquisa em Ginástica, gostaria de agradecer a entrevista do professor Keith Russel e dizer que foi um prazer tê-lo como professor visitante durante esse período na UNICAMP. Muito obrigado.